We're talking today to the writer Antoine Vanner, who's the author of the Dawlish Chronicles, a series of naval fiction set in the Victorian era. The books so far are Britannia's Wolf, Britannia's Reach, and Britannia's Shark, the novels published so far in the series. Antoine, why did you decide to write about the Victorian era?
Well, I've always been interested in history anyway, and history tells us how did we get to where we are today. What were the events, what were the personalities, what were the movements that created the world we live in. And that was never more true than in relation to the 19th century, which is an era of massive change, which in due course led to the triumphs and disasters of the 20th century and the consequences of which we live today. On top of that, it was for many people of my generation who were born around the middle of the 20th century, it was an era in some ways, it felt like the day before yesterday, because our grandparents were born in the 1870s or the 1880s, and they came to maturity in the Victorian period. We heard from them about it. They told us about their youth, about the world they grew up in, etc. So in that respect, it represented history one could almost touch. It was also a time when there were very significant, indeed seismic changes coming about in terms of the international relations. The British Empire, which is a very complex organism, was reaching its apogee in this time. And a number of the other established powers, France, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, etc., were running into significant difficulties that they weren't always aware of, which were to lead to disaster later on. The growing power of the newly formed German Empire was becoming massive, not only in relation to industrial and economic power, but in relation to its military potential, and the threat that that represented was underestimated for most of the later 19th century. So, very interesting period, one which has great consequences for our own time, and one which represents, through its dynamism, a very interesting background against which a novelist can set his or her stories.
Most naval fiction is set in the age of fighting sail, particularly the Napoleonic period. You have chosen to venture into the uncharted waters of Victorian naval steam power. Why was that?
I've always been interested in the way in which people manage change. And the challenge, of course, was never greater than in the 19th century. Not just the technical change from sail to steam in relation to the Royal Navy and other navies, but all the associated social and organizational aspects that were associated with it. The 19th century was a time where it probably saw greater change than at any other century in human history. If we were to go back with a time machine to the year 1800, the beginning of the Napoleonic period, we would find a world that was alien to us in just about every way, especially in relation to the values, no less than to the technology. On the other hand, if we were to go back to the year 1900, we would find a world not all that different to the world we have today. We'd probably be able to function reasonably well in it. We'd recognize a lot of the same things. Electricity had made its appearance. Railways and steamships had shrunk distance like never before in human history. The arrival of the telegraph had facilitated a global economy. So that was a world of very significant change. And I wanted to set my fiction in that. And particularly, of course, in the Navy, because anybody who joined the Navy in the 1850s, as my protagonist does, as a young boy, he enters a Navy which was commanded by men who'd come to maturity, master their skills, in the age of Nelson, in the Napoleonic Wars. But that individual who joined in the 1850s would serve right through into World War I, right over that period. And they would have to cope with the introduction of amazing new change, the improvement of steam technology, the introduction of armor plate, big guns, torpedoes, and later in the area as well, the introduction of radio, of submarines, and of even of aircraft.
What qualities did you think were important when you were creating your protagonist, Nicholas Dawlish?
I thought it was important to have a character who was essentially a man of the 19th century, a genuine Victorian. I always dislike the sort of historical fiction in which the protagonist, whether male or female, are given the attitudes and the values of the 21st century, because it just doesn't ring true. So to me it was important that Nicholas Dawlish should be a man of the Victorian period, and the values he would have would be, in some cases, very different to those that we hold today. He's very much an establishment figure. He does break the rules occasionally, but he is committed to the maintenance of the establishment. He's committed to service to Queen and country, and he's prepared to put his life on the line for that. In fact, that's not that uncommon today either, of course, for serving personnel. He has some constraints, some bugbears, which we'd find perhaps a bit strange today. He's very concerned with class. Worries about the fact, for example, that the woman he loves, who is somebody who at one stage was a servant, is something that bugs him quite seriously, as we saw in the first novel, in Britannia's Wolf. He's also got a very robust attitude, as most Victorian military people had, in relation to dealing with injustice. For example, when he's dealing with people whom today we would regard as terrorists, and when they've committed atrocities, he has absolutely no hesitation in treating them very, very roughly indeed in ways which today would probably land them in court on charges of violation of the human rights of terrorists. So he's a different man. He comes from a different era, and I wanted him to cope with all the concerns, all the worries, all the challenges that somebody of his class and his generation would cope. He is a Victorian.
We've learned from the series so far that Nicholas Dawlish is a man of high moral character. He's often torn between doing his duty on the one hand and taking the moral high road on the other. He's driven by ambition. Do you think this puts him under pressure in that sense?
Well, he's ambitious. And when we first meet him, he's in his mid-30s. And that is a very significant break point for him in the course of his life. By that stage, he has had about 20 years in the Royal Navy, because boys joined up very early in those years. And in those 20 or so years he's been in the Navy, he has established himself as a competent seaman, as a good officer, as a leader of men. But now he's moving on to something else, and now the softer issues are becoming important. One of the concerns he has is that he doesn't make relationships easily. As he moves on to more senior challenges, it's no longer a question just to be a good seaman or somebody who can run a ship efficiently or fight a ship efficiently. He's got to take into account political, diplomatic, even economic constraints in relation to the problems he addresses. And very often those bring with them great moral and ethical complications, as we're seeing particularly in the second book, in Britannia's Reach. And he's got to find solutions that balance his integrity with actually getting the job done. So yes, it is difficult for him, and as he moves on to yet further senior commands and senior assignments, he's going to find it increasingly difficult. And luckily he has his wonderful wife to help him through that, but he's still going to find it pretty hard.
Thank you, Antoine, for talking to us today about the Dawlish Chronicles. We look forward to speaking to you about your books again soon. The published books will be displayed at the end of this video. Thank you for watching.